sourcing and logistics as our discussion topic. And within sourcing, we have aspects related to strategic sourcing, strategic cost management, supplier management, supplier selection, supplier development. And in logistics, we are discussing logistics fundamentals, trade-offs that are there in logistics and logistics processes. So I'll go over some of them, just give you overall broad overview of what we have discussed in video, and then details of that you will find in the videos. So strategic sourcing, one of the foundational tools that is used by many organizations is what we call the Krelix matrix. It's essentially a 2x2 matrix that divides all the items that organizations source based on the value potential. That is, how much is the dollar amount spent on these items, and the supply market complexity, which means that how complex that supply market is, how many substitutes might exist or not exist, because if there's no substitutes, then it's a very complex market. How many other competitors might be there as part of that particular item suppliers. If you don't have too many competitors, then it's a more complex market. So there is x-axis supply market complexity and y-axis, which is value potential. And based on that, you could come up with different types of items falling into these different quadrants. Those items that are low on supply market complexity as well as the value potential, these are called non-critical or routine items. These are the items where you are looking at competitive bidding among suppliers. You at times also want to automate that process of sourcing these items. You don't want to spend too much effort and resources in managing this supply of routine items. Whereas on the other hand, you have strategic or critical items that are the ones where you have high supply market complexity and high value potential. For these items, you need a completely different strategy. You need long-term relationships with suppliers. Many times strategic alliances, technology alliances are part of this quadrant. So when you have items that you're sourcing that have high supply market complexity as well as high value potential, then you are looking at a different type of management from sourcing point of view. You could have a situation where the value potential is not very large. In other words, you don't have too much of dollars spent on certain items, but the supply market complexity is pretty high. In other words, you don't have too many suppliers to work with. These would be examples of bottleneck items. These are the items where you will have a sourcing strategy which revolves around finding substitutes, developing other suppliers if possible, who could potentially be your backup suppliers if needed. So that's a strategy which would be necessary for items that fall here. And then you have leverage items where the supply market complexity is not high, but you have very high value potential. A lot of dollars spent is on these items. For leverage items, what you're looking for is a way in which an organization can get some consolidation among the items that you're buying from suppliers so that you can get volume leveraging. You can get some discounts based on that volume leveraging. So different strategies based on different types of items. For strategic cost management, this week we have discussion about how it differs from lowering price, which has been the traditional activity which sourcing function has been performing, but over time sourcing has taken more of a strategic role. So when we go from lowering prices to a strategic cost management concept, where now we are not just looking at lowering price, but we want to understand the underlying causes of the cost of an item. So here we look at 4 possible ways in which strategic cost management can be undertaken. The first is spend analysis, where we are interested in understanding where the spend is occurring. So direct spend, which means the ones which are directly going into the service or product that is being made. Indirect spend, which is required for the operations of the organization, electricity and other kinds of spends, which would also be a kind of expense that you'll have to take care of. And then capital spend, like buildings and large equipment. So you're trying to categorize the type of spend and then understanding whether that's appropriately spent with the right supplier. Are there possibilities of consolidation? volume leveraging, etc. The second is price analysis, understanding price across different suppliers and seeing whether you're getting competitive pricing or not. Cost analysis, which is more like a should cost, what should be the cost of the item. So there is a way in which you actually drill down into the cost components, cost drivers of an item, and then try to see what should be the cost and whether you are getting the right price based on the costing that you have done. And then total cost of ownership analysis, where not just the acquisition cost is considered, but also the cost incurred while you're operating that equipment, or the cost post-use for that equipment. How do you, what's the recycling cost for it? There's an overall understanding of the cost involved with that item, which needs to be taken as part of total cost of ownership. So those are things that you do in the strategic cost management. So we talked about spend analysis a little bit, in other words, where we are trying to see for the indirect, direct, and capital spend, whether we are receiving the correct amount for what we paid, who are our biggest supplier, opportunities for combining spend, etc. Price analysis, comparing suppliers and looking at the price against an external benchmark and understanding whether we're getting the right pricing and are we comparing the right kinds of metrics across suppliers, which could include a more multidimensional set of metrics like quality, lead time, warranty, etc. Then cost analysis, where we are analyzing individual cost elements. And this is what we call should cost analysis. This helps you understand what should be the cost of the item. And then on top of it, there's a profit margin that the supplier adds. And after that, does the price look reasonable in light of the cost of the item? And finally, total cost of ownership, which includes acquisition cost, ownership cost, and post-ownership cost. Total cost of ownership is also helpful when organization has to decide whether they want to outsource it or they may want to make it themselves. Again, that decision many times becomes critical for organizations, and TCO helps in making that decision in a more informed way. We then have some video discussion on supplier management, and supplier management basically involves 4 steps. You're identifying the need for the organization, could be in the form of material, could be in the form of some service, could be also in the form of some relationship that is needed from a certain supplier. Then you look for suppliers who can fulfill that need. So you are searching, evaluating, negotiating with these suppliers. Then once the supplier has been selected, you are developing them. There's issue resolution, there is continuous improvement that is going on for the supplier, and then providing feedback on an ongoing timely basis so that they understand what their goals are, how they've been performing on those, and sort of a report card for them. Within the set of things that we just talked, supplier development is important because of the fact that you would have suppliers sometimes who are not meeting the requirements. So here we have certain requirements set for suppliers. S3 does not meet it. S3 just about meets that requirement, and S1 has exceeded that requirement. So obviously we need to know why S3 is not able to fulfill that requirement. Is there a possibility of it being developed so that it can work on those aspects which needs improvement? For S2, which has been fulfilling the needs, is there a possibility that in the future this may not be meeting the requirements? Because over time you would be increasing your expectations from these suppliers. As you can see, from year Y-1 to year Y, then Y+1, Y+2, the expectations are exceeding, and you want the suppliers also to stretch themselves and meet those expectations. So we know that the next year itself, supplier S2 will not look as good as it is in Y-1. In fact, by year Y+2, even supplier S1 may not be fulfilling the needs as per the requirements for the organization. So to make this dynamic change within the supplier come true, they need to be developed on a timely basis. And that's something which supplier development effort takes into consideration. The process that you follow is you identify critical suppliers that need development, form a cross-functional team within the company, You meet with suppliers' top management team, identify the opportunities and probability for development. You also define some key metrics. What are the cost sharing mechanism? If there is cost that the supplier is incurring as part of the development process, is the buyer also going to share some of that cost on supplier's behalf? Reach an agreement on key projects, which ones needs attention and joint resource requirements. And finally, monitor the status of supplier projects and modify strategies as and when it's appropriate. Scorecard was the last step, where you are providing information to the supplier as to how they are performing. And there again, there is a design process that you follow and implement it. You identify the objectives that are related to supplier's performance. Could be multidimensional. Typically, it is multidimensional, where you have cost considerations, quality, delivery, innovation sometimes. Then you develop a balanced and objective performance measure. And this is something where you want to engage supplier as you're developing this set of measures. So engage suppliers to ensure that the measures are credible and actionable. And finally, educate supplier on performance measures and implications, why these performance measures are in there and what is the implication for the organization. So that's something which becomes sort of the foundational tool that then help the two organizations improve performance. An example of supplier scorecard: different categories on which supplier is being evaluated: cost and pricing, supply chain and production. Likewise, you could have quality, you could have product development. And for each of them, you will have subcategories on which they have been rated. And there is a well-defined metric that is understood by the supplier and the buying organization. Depending on how they perform on each of these different subcategories, they are rated as A, B, C, D, and all the way till F in this particular case. And those situations where you see a low rating like C, D, etc., are the areas where the supplier then needs to do work on, maybe requires development. The second aspect that we discussed this week relates to logistics. In fact, some of the discussion we had earlier in the course also have processes under logistics, which has been covered through inventory management discussion, earlier forecasting. Some of those also fall under logistics processes in certain extent. And therefore, we'll see that there is sort of a combination, but logistics here, we are going more, taking a deep dive into aspects related to warehousing, transportation, which were not covered earlier. So essentially, logistics provides economic utility through providing place and time utility. So it makes sure that the products, items, equipments are at the right place at the right time. So in a sense, it's helping with flow, both forward and reverse flow of goods. It helps with storage of goods and services, as well as information that is needed, so that the customer requirements can be met at the time when it's supposed to be met. So in essence, logistics provides strategic advantage to an organization through cost related factors. For example, there are decisions you'll take in logistics which will influence the cost that will be incurred by the organization. Flow related factors, there are decisions that you'll take in logistics that will help speed up the flow, slow down the flow, depending on what the right decision might be for a given circumstance. Helps with access. Many times you need to reach at places which are remote, and logistics help in accessing these locations. And then sustainability, either through transportation modes that has been selected, reverse logistics, where you're getting the product back to a place where it can be reused. All those things again requires logistics to make them come true. Now, as part of logistics, there are some fundamental trade-offs that has to be taken on a day-to-day basis, on a tactical basis, many times strategic basis by logistics professionals. The first one is cost to cost trade-off, which is many times when organizations decide on one parameter within the logistics arena, let's say transportation mode, that will influence the cost on the other end of the arena, let's say inventory cost. So for instance, if you choose a faster mode of transportation, that will cost more on the transportation end. So air mode will always be more expensive than trucking mode. But then you can reduce the cost that will be incurred in inventory that has to be carried at the place where it's being used. So you are trading off the cost of transportation with the cost of inventory. So those kinds of decisions sometimes are becoming important, fundamental, while taking a decision about what's the right way to manage a certain customer demand. Likewise, modalities, which mode is right for a given customer demand? Should you be choosing a fast transportation mode like an air shipment versus a truck shipment? So that's again a trade-off which needs to be taken into consideration, where the lead times, cost, other things are to be accounted for. And then cost to service, which again is what is the right cost that the organization can incur for the required service level that actually makes sense for the organization. So achieving a 99.99% service level can always be attained as long as you can incur that much of cost, but is that the right combination of cost and service for the organization based on the customer demand? And the competitive scenario is something which logistics takes into consideration on a daily basis. In logistics, similar to sourcing, where we talked about total cost of ownership, similar concept is the idea of landed cost analysis, where we are looking at costs incurred by organizations by considering multiple dimensions of cost, moving with the less than truckload versus truckload shipment, versus the inventory cost that will be incurred, ordering cost that will be incurred. So you're trying to add up all the cost components that comprise of a given order, and then understand what is the landed cost for a customer and what would be the right cost structure for the company, which would mean that how much inventory should you carry, how much which transportation mode you should have, how the ordering process should work. All those decisions will then rely on the right landed cost analysis. In logistics processes, we have these 5 processes. Demand processing, which is essentially the idea of managing demand through understanding what's the demand for a particular product. And this could be independent demand, which means the end item that is used, and you need to forecast each item by itself. It could be dependent demand, where it's coming as a kit, where multiple items are part of that kit. So these items are dependent on each other because they are part of that one kit. Hence, the demand processing will mean that that dependent demand has to be analyzed carefully. And then there is a derived demand, which is one which is artificially created by managerial decisions like promotions or advertising. It shoots up demand during those time periods, and you have to manage that demand when that demand increases. So that's demand processing. You have inventory management. We've discussed this as a separate unit, but also as part of logistics processes. Transportation, you have warehousing, and then you have structured network, which is the network level management, because you have different suppliers sending products to their distribution centers or warehouses, from where it gets shipped to potentially the customer's distribution center, and then to warehouses, and then finally to the retail location or the point of use. So it ends up creating a complex network. And how do you manage that network is another process that is part of the logistics processes. Now, since we have discussed demand processing in the form of the forecasting discussions and inventory management also as part of our prior unit, transportation, we talked a little bit in terms of the type of transportation modes, and there's a little more detail in the video in terms of the cost structure, how they play out with different modes, what is the level of sustainability impact that each of these transportation modes have. Warehousing is one where we have not spent a little bit of time in today's discussion. So in warehousing, we have decision to be made regarding the right sizing of the warehouse, for which there are certain tools, the right number of warehouses that the organization should have. Again, there are tools like square root rule, which we have discussed in the video, the center of gravity approach of where to locate that warehouse. Again, something we have discussed a little bit in the video. Along with that, you also have these warehouses that are this open space where you're keeping products, but then they play a role based on what that warehouse is supposed to be doing. So some warehouses act as consolidation warehouses, which means that they take in small shipments and then they send out larger shipments. So this is what typically happens in global trade. You have these small shipments from multiple manufacturers coming to one big warehouse from where they get consolidated and then are shipped to the customer location. So that's one kind of warehouse. An opposite kind would be cross-docking warehouse, where these large shipments come in and then they're again split apart and then sent out into these final locations as smaller shipments. So this is something which happens when you have multiple hospitals where deliveries have to be made from a central distribution center or central stocking point, and that's an example of cross-docking process. And the warehouse which allows such cross-docking process to occur is what we call a break bulk facility, the one where you can split apart these large shipments into smaller ones. So there needs to be the right kind of labor there, like right kind of equipment, which allows you to break these bulk inbound shipments into smaller outbound shipments. So that's the type of facility which helps with cross-docking. Network management, one of the processes in logistics, essentially implies that we need to look at the overall network where the shipments are going and from where they are coming from. So you could have a situation like this where you have different cities who are shipping to each other, and each shipment can go from each of these different locations, which means there are several permutations and combinations that can occur, which can increase cost quite substantially if you allow all these possible shipments to take place. An alternative approach is what we call a hub and spoke system, where one of these facilities will become the hub where everything is being shipped, and from there it gets shipped out to wherever it has to go. So it kind of acts as a consolidation point. So the idea of which kind of approach of network management is going to be appropriate will depend on the overall cost, which includes the number of facility cost versus the transportation cost, inventory management cost, etc. So the total cost will determine how these networks will perform. Moving on to week 5 articles, we have 4 articles that are required reading for this week. The first one is how logistics can service healthcare. Now, this is an article which basically puts the overall logistics function as one which also includes logistics and sourcing. So many times you have these terms that are used in a sort of less stringent way, less formal way, and you cover many other functions which could be under this idea of logistics, at least in this article. So they start with internal distribution networks that exist in healthcare, where storerooms, pharmaceuticals, office supplies, food maintenance, cleaning, sterilization, all these different items that are being used in healthcare create a complex network. So on a daily basis, you have supply carts, material management personnel, nurses and other staff continuously circulating back and forth between the storage areas and the points of care. And this creates high cost situations because of high inventory volumes of different items and the resource and effort that is needed to manage inventory, whether it's in the form of ordering, whether it's in the form of storage, distribution, as well as searching for missing items. So many times nurses who are meant to take care of the patient have to spend their time on searching for these missing items, which costs the healthcare organization. So an assessment has shown that up to 46% of a hospital's total operating budget is spent on logistics related activities. Out of them, 27% are being spent on supplies and equipment, and 19% is on labor, which is working towards these logistics processes. These could be logistics professionals, buyers, stock keepers, but also healthcare professionals like nurses doing some of the logistics processes. And the study also estimates that nursing staff spends on average about 10% of their time performing logistics tasks instead of taking care of patients, which is something which needs to be avoided. And 48% of supply chain related process costs are avoidable through the implementation of better logistics integration. So this integration is essentially integration of the healthcare organization with the distributor and manufacturer. And when you make that integration seamless, then every organization can benefit. And essentially the benefit will be about 48%, with 41% will be incurred by healthcare providers. 33% of that will be at manufacturers, 26% of that at the distributors. So you can actually benefit at different points within the supply chain. Emphasizes some of the leading practices in healthcare logistics. One is the vendor managed replenishment, where distributors carry out all replenishment activities and deliver supplies directly at the point of use. This is happening in many healthcare organizations. In fact, the case study that is for this week has some of the aspects related to vendor managed replenishments. So by doing this, you avoid one of the links within the supply chain, hospitals, storeroom, and that then helps in reducing potential inefficiencies that can be there. The second leading practice is automated transportation system for small and large loads. Could be in the form of automated guided vehicles in the warehouse. It could be overhead rail transportation system. The article does give some examples of how these technologies are being used in some of the hospitals, and then also robots, etc. Hospital flow-through design, which is the layout. We talked about the process layout in the first week itself. So the way hospital will create this flow-through design or the layout will have influence in how the healthcare logistics will be managed. So if there are dedicated corridors and dedicated elevators for patients, and that will help in ensuring that the logistics can use other ways for moving these products from one point to the other, and hence increase the efficiency and effectiveness. Two-bin replenishment system is kind of an inventory system, which we have talked about as part of our inventory management discussion. It's both flexible and simple to use, and hence something which can help with healthcare logistics. And finally, blending logistics with clinical resources, how the two professionals who are working within healthcare organizations can work together, and re-engineering logistics. Many times you need to re-engineer certain processes. Again, part of our first week discussion of process re-engineering, that you need some of these re-engineering that will be needed to understand how the healthcare organization can actually benefit. So they provide two case studies as examples of what was done there that helped these organizations to reduce their cost or improve their performance. The first case is one where the cost of supply chain processes was estimated at more than approximately 1.6 million Canadian dollars annually for a total of more than 79,000 hours, or 43.5 full-time employees. So there was that much of cost being incurred, and that needed to be removed. And the reason why this cost was incurred was because of low degree of automation, both in terms of material flow and information transmission, a duplication of replenishment activities in central distribution and the stores department. There was significant involvement by nursing staff in the replenishment of medical and pharmaceutical supplies. Logistics processes were fragmented between many departments and positions, and logistics equipment was not adapted to the hospital size, both in stores and user departments. So there were several of these considerations that had to be taken into consideration. So as part of the solution, there was an optimization of all processes associated with supply chain material flows, which then resulted in a net discounted value of the gains, approximately 1.9 million Canadian dollars over 5 years. So the NPV is what they are mentioning here, and 42% of which were generated in nursing hours saved because of this change in the processes. So that's the first case study. The second case study that they present is one which consisted of the replenishment process of medical supplies on a surgical 32-bed ward, and included the gathering of products for utilization in the nursing unit of an acute care rural regional hospital in Canada. So to manage that replenishment process, they analyzed This replenishment process currently it incorporated 6 stocking locations, which included 2 storerooms and 4 nursing stations. After the analysis, what they did was that these 6 storage locations were replaced by 1 central storeroom and 4 movable carts. The carts were then stocked with the medical supplies, linens, and bedding regularly required by the nursing staff. Medical supplies are transported on the cart rather than the nursing staff having to stop what they're doing and go and fetch them. So that helped in reducing the time that the nursing staff was spending in gathering these supplies. Therefore, the time required for the principal replenishment reduced by 60% by doing this. At the same time, nursing staff indicated that they had decreased their movement by about 40% compared to the initial situation. So there were benefits from both the replenishment time as well as the time that nursing staff was spending on logistics processes. The second article is how sourcing excellence can lower hospital costs. In this article, we are looking at the overall cost that organizations are incurring with their supplies and services. So the supplies and services is growing the fastest in terms of the non-labor expenses within the healthcare sector. And that means that we need to somehow curtail that increasing cost on supplies and services. And to do so, the article first emphasizes the type of evolution that happens within the sourcing function within healthcare organizations. The first phase typically is where the sourcing function is primarily focusing on basic indirect spend. So there's a systematic process which identifies and captures savings. There are some performance management systems, and you communicate benefits to broader organization. You add some new talent to sourcing to do all these things. And the common levers that are being used for basic indirects is demand management, which is forecasting the need, vendor consolidation, so that you can get some economies of scale, and price negotiation where permissible. The second phase of evolution is when the sourcing also is accounting or taking care of clinical preference items. So here we now have a sourcing function that needs to collaborate with clinicians to capture opportunities requiring behavioral changes. It expands the scope to include non-price elements. So here we're not just looking at price reduction, but also the total cost of ownership. We just talked about it. There's a refinement of performance management because it's multidimensional performance now. And then there's the upgradation of IT infrastructure to take care of these different performance measures and understand how they're all doing. The common levers for this phase of evolution is the utilization management, how it's being utilized, each item, how they are being utilized, and what's the right way that we can create a sourcing strategy for it. Strategy for using third-party contracting services. So we need to know how GPOs can be leveraged, their overall volume leveraging skills can be put in use in our sourcing requirements and our sourcing processes. And in this, you also are sourcing high preference clinical categories. So that's the way the second phase is normally managed. And the third phase is where healthcare organization and the sourcing function starts creating strategic alliances, supply innovative approaches, example, joint ventures, performance-based contracts. It could be with the 3PL organization, it could be with the suppliers, manufacturers. You build advantage supplier partnerships across different categories of items that are being sourced, proactively participate in the M&A dialogue that might be necessary at times, explore sourcing business line extensions to improve the top line growth. So instead of just reducing the cost, you also are trying to see if the organization can gain top line growth through extensions of the type of items that you're sourcing, and therefore providing more services and hence higher revenue than what was achieved earlier. Here, the common levels will be supply chain alliances. You're creating some global sourcing strategies, generic sourcing strategies, and then product distribution strategy for different products, what the right distribution strategy might be. The procurement groups typically handle different types of items. We just talked about the evolution of sourcing function, and there we noticed that from basic indirect spend, you get into clinician preference items, and there, this is a traditional movement from basic indirects to low preference clinical to high preference clinical. And as we get into high preference clinical, the sourcing function is involved in setting up sourcing arrangements for surgical packs, for cardiovascular implants, orthopedic implants. And these are expensive items and that require careful understanding of the total cost and understanding the right suppliers for them. So that's something which is the traditional area, but non-traditional areas also sourcing has been contributing, whether it's in the form of sourcing the benefit plans, life, long-term disability plans, etc. Capital equipment, capital spending in the form of imaging equipment, patient beds, operating room tables, etc. Again, those are the areas which sourcing has been involved. And then capital consolidation in the form of site preparation, mechanical installations, etc. It used to be subcontracted, still is subcontracted to project management organizations. But in many healthcare organizations, the sourcing function is also able to take some of these non-traditional areas and address them as part of their sourcing activity. The article then emphasizes the unique or nuanced nature of pharmaceutical sourcing, because in pharmaceutical drugs, you would have on-patent drugs, you could have off-patent drugs, and then within on-patent, you could have drugs that have little substitutability versus the ones which has room for substitutability, or there's competition. Depending on the type of drugs, you will have different strategies that needs to be put in place. In all these cases, you do need a joint team, because ultimately the drugs are going to be used for patient care, and the clinical contribution in that sourcing decision is very important. So joint team will involve clinicians, but also sourcing professionals. And we need to know where there's room for negotiation versus where there are no room for negotiation. There's no room for negotiation, and hence something else needs to be done. So in on-patent drugs with little substitutability, it has the least room to negotiate. So the team typically looks at an understanding of the overall benefit and risk, and tries to understand the economics of its use, how it's being used. And in some case, identifying if there can be some segmentation with regards to which drug can be potentially aimed at which patient based on its likely benefit, most likely benefit. So that's why clinicians' involvement is extremely important in such decisions. The other one where on-patent drugs has competition or can be substituted, in this case, there's room to maneuver, and the team identifies the most effective drug within each class and then limit the formulary to that particular medication. It can also determine where substitutes can be used as against the existing ones, and that can then help in reducing costs through volume leveraging. For off-patent generics, you substitute a molecularly equivalent generic for branded products. And again, it is the area where you can bring in some competition into the negotiation process and thereby gain some savings. Now, in many of these evolutionary processes that we just talked about, or also in the pharmaceutical drug sourcing, there's involvement of physicians that is essential. And hence, there has to be a way in which sourcing professional can effectively engage physicians. And to do so, basically what you need are certain skill sets and certain areas that need emphasis in healthcare. So for instance, quality and safety, patient safety, procurement group should be able to differentiate between clinical product decisions that are evidence-based and those that are solely based on physician preference. And this can only be possible if there is a careful analysis of different items and there is a lot of discussion with the clinicians who are practicing at that particular facility. So that's one of the important requirement to effectively engage physicians. There should be transparent case for change. The physicians who are involved in making these changes, they should be given the context for why the changes are being considered. Explanation should go beyond just cost consideration. It could, for example, involve legal risk. Many times, if you have different standards, and that could be one of the reasoning, and that needs to be communicated. You need to communicate why the changes are reasonable, how it makes sense for all parties. And then the group can ask some physicians to actually participate in negotiations and ask that they provide them the right message to vendors at other settings. There needs to be alignment of incentives because physicians are making changes to the way they are conducting their activities, so they need to derive some benefit, and this could be different based on the physician's role within the healthcare organization. If they are employed with the healthcare organization, the article emphasizes certain ways in which you can align those incentives. And if they are consulting with that healthcare organization, it will be a different way in which you will align incentives. And finally, track changes. You treat physicians as partners and inform them about the key decisions and how savings have been realized through those decisions. Now, to succeed in all these endeavors, it's important to have the management infrastructure, which means you need to have top management involvement, proper governance of this. You need the talent required because sourcing needs to go beyond just cost reduction to understanding a holistic cost structure as well as other performance dimensions, and also the ability to relate with clinicians. So all these skills needs to be in place. And then clinician involvement. And there are three potential approaches that the article highlights. A hospital or system can ensure that clinicians serve as core members of every team that are investigating any type of clinical supplies. It can establish a separate team charged with developing and overseeing implementation of the new procurement approach, or it can elevate sourcing to a leadership track function and rotate physician administrators through procurement positions. So there are ways in which you can involve clinicians from a structural point of view. The third article is procurement strategy for high-tech medical equipment, especially when you have a sole sourcing environment where you can only source from a certain supplier given the technological requirements that you have. So the article starts with the strategic healthcare standardization in a sole source environment and emphasizes that essentially it's a risk management and relationship management activity that sourcing has to play. You have certain risks that the seller is trying to avoid, like schedule risk, the requirement coming at different schedules, and therefore the supplier has to fulfill them at an erratic schedule, which can then increase the cost for the supplier. Or delivery risk, which means that this item might be needed at more than the places that were contractually indicated, which again increases the delivery risk for the supplier. And contract compliance in general, like what the contract was saying versus what was eventually needed because of the criticality of that equipment could sometimes be different, and seller wants to understand how much they are taking all these risks. On the buyer side, you would have the price risk. Because it's a sole sourcing environment, you don't have too much negotiation ability with other suppliers or get competitive bidding. And there's a performance risk of whether this item will actually fulfill the requirements that you have. So you're trying to balance it as part of the sourcing function. And it gives the case of the Veterans Health Administration and how they have sourced teleaudiology equipment. And in that case, they emphasized the schedule and delivery risk because there was a systematic increase during certain quarters that the supplier has to fulfill, and also increase in the number of places where the delivery was expected. And hence, there needed to be a further discussion between the supplier and the buyer in this case, and they had to redo some of the contractual agreement or contractual terms. The other was the compliance risk, which again, they have emphasized in this case with an equipment, high-tech medical equipment. which had a centralized contract, but then many times there were some of these requirements coming from these decentralized points of use for the equipment, and that needed to be fulfilled, which caused compliance risk for the supplier. So that's the kind of risk that then needs to be addressed through working on the contractual terms. Then the case also, or the article also highlights the way these contracts are structured across different federal agencies. Mainly it is comparing federal agencies, Department of Veteran Affairs and Veteran Health Administration. And they have shown that the percentage of sole source procurement actions at the Veterans Health Administration is higher than the other two. And they've emphasized that typically when you have more of these sole sourced arrangements, the potential savings are relatively low. The mean saving for these sole sourced actions are at 0.55% versus competed actions. You have a higher saving of 1.33%. So they are kind of making a case that as and when possible, you want to find opportunities for creating competed actions. So this is similar to the idea of what we called the bottleneck items in the Krelix matrix or the strategic sourcing framework of finding substitutes or finding potential other suppliers, developing them if needed. Some highlights of what considerations one needs to keep in mind when medical technology purchasing decisions have to be taken. And these are kind of listed and self-explanatory within the article. The last article is about measuring the logistics performance of internal hospital supply chains. And it's a literature review, but through the literature review, it's emphasizing the type of performance measures that needs to be accounted for. It starts with an assessment of the cost incurred by hospitals as part of their internal hospital supply chain management. And the logistics operations has typically a high cost that is being incurred in those processes, ranging from 20% to 45% of the total hospital operating budget. The operating theater happens to be one of the major cost driver for a hospital, where the medical supplies and equipment could take up to 40 to 60% of the hospital's supply expenditure. Internal supply chain links the logistics processes and patient care services within the hospital. So there are several key issues that are contributing to this cost structure. This could be fragmented supply base, supply chain inefficiencies, excessive administrative expense, poor management, inappropriate care, etc. And it also emphasizes that there's a lag factor in healthcare sector as compared to other industries, and this is because of certain aspects that are very specific to healthcare sector, like regulation. There's outdated information technology systems in many cases. There's poor inventory and distribution management systems, lack of executive involvement, no process improvement culture. Relatively speaking, again, so these are changing over time, and as we speak, there are many hospitals who have done some great activities which are helping in those processes that we just talked about in the previous slide. So they now highlight some of the performance indicators which organizations are using or can use as part of their inventory management and as part of their distribution management through a literature review that they did. And they found that quality, time, financial, and productivity are the four sort of big bucket items. Within each of them, you have some of these categories within which performance measures can be created, like availability, which could be service level that you can offer, stock out levels, inventory visibility, criticality of inventory items, and patient safety. These are under quality dimension. Then you have time, where you can have replenishment time, clinician staff time, or their involvement. Financial could be inventory cost, the value of stock or stock wastage, and then productivity, how fast the inventory is turning over, what's the utilization rate, standardization, etc. So you have different performance indicators for inventory management, and likewise different performance indicators for distribution, again categorized into those four buckets, and each of them are explained a little bit more in detail in the article.